The summer of 2018, I was working from a coffee shop, surfing through some nerdy journals, when I came across an odd directive from this regulatory agency that didn't make sense to me. Now, being a university researcher in my past life, I was trained that if something didn't make sense, to follow this trail of breadcrumbs. So I requested all the related research articles that are pertaining to this decision, and I started mapping out the timeline of events which led to it, hopefully to outline the rationale behind this mandate. Now, what started as a casual afternoon of curiosity turned into this complete obsession. I dove deep into this, researching for months, almost forgetting about some of the responsibilities that I had to do with growing our own kava company, because I was so determined and stubborn to get to the bottom of all this. And throughout my research, I discovered something about this kava industry, something that was often told to me as rumor, but I was never given any actual proof of it. But one by one, over the weeks that followed, the evidence began to emerge. And trust me, you're not going to believe it. The result of all this research was this big blog post that I wrote labeled The Big Kava Scare, which was pages and pages long, set to go live across all of our social media channels, explaining the events of what happened, the facts behind many of the health claims, and the people that were possibly involved. But I never published it because I was a coward. I was scared. I was scared about the consequences that it would have on me and my family. It's March 2025 right now, and a lot has changed. It took me almost 7 years of on and off introspection and hesitation to get the courage to speak up publicly about this. And to my knowledge, no one else has really come forward to shed light on the specific aspects of this narrative regarding kava's murky past. And honestly, I'm still a little worried to share this, because the more that I look into this, the more that I'm continuing to unearth these possible ties to these very powerful groups, all of which obviously would not enjoy me voicing my opinion on this. However, recently there have been a number of popular documentaries and outspoken voices critiquing these industries, and all of the directors and writers, while receiving some beatings through the press, are still alive. So I'm feeling a little bit more comfortable being outspoken about it. But if something happens to me, you will know why. So the most common questions we get are regarding kava and the liver. And it's been about 22 and a half years after the worldwide kava ban, which is what led to all these misnomers regarding liver cases in kava. When we first started this project in 2015 of making kava accessible to everyone, I used to believe that kava had this bad rep with the liver because people were using kava extracts as well as low quality kava. And the extraction process brings out these cytotoxic chemicals that make the end product dangerous to your liver. Chemicals which are types of chalcones which are native to the kava plant, known as flavocavanes. Chalcones are natural compounds that are found in plants, which serve as these key building blocks for biological molecules. And kava's chalcones usually stay in the root that you filter out when you're making a kava beverage, which is why you're not supposed to actually ingest kava's root. But they tend to be pulled out in high concentrations when people are making kava extracts. And while there is still some truth to these claims, the vast majority of evidence actually points in another direction entirely. Long story short, I'm pretty sure that I was wrong, and I deeply apologize to anyone I may have steered the wrong way. First off, quick disclaimer, I'm not a medically trained physician, so please do not substitute any of this for medical advice. Any and all statements here are opinions of my own and do not reflect Drink Root, the team, or any of the establishments that we support. These are just my opinions. In the late 1990s, kava, a ceremonial drink that was native to the tribes of the South Pacific, was discovered to have a remarkable ability to ease anxiety disorders. But this was hardly the first time that an ancient plant was found to possess profound healing properties. Throughout history, humanity has often turned to the natural world for remedies, and ancient plants in particular have repeatedly revealed themselves as real sources for profound healing. As Bojana Petrovska wrote in Pharmacon, healing with medicinal plants is as old as mankind itself. Ever since ancient times, in search for rescue from their disease, people looked for drugs in nature. And this relationship between humans and plant-based medicine stretches back farther than most realize. The ancient Sumerians of Mesopotamia, widely regarded as the first true civilization, left behind detailed records of medicinal recipes dating back 5,000 years. Science has shown that these concoctions are not just mere folklore, but thoroughly tested and meticulously crafted formulas that are documenting the therapeutic use of the plants long before modern pharmacology existed. The Ebers Papyrus scrolls found in Egypt contain over 700 remedies remedies that date back over 3,500 years. The Penti Sao, written by Emperor Shenyang in 2500 BC, cataloged 365 medicinal plants for Eastern medicines, many of which are still integral to traditional Chinese medicine today. The Akkadians, the Babylonians, Assyrians, ancient Indian Rig Vedas, ancient Greek and Romans, Mayans, Aztec, Incan, Islamic, and more all turn to the diversity of the richness of ancient medicinal plant Pharmacon, many of which led to the development of modern patentable pharmaceuticals. When I was a kid, pharmaceutical companies reigned supreme, not necessarily king in raw power, as one could argue that they are even more powerful today, but more so in their perceived authority. Doctors, pharmacists, and medical institutions were trusted back then without question. The prevailing belief was that these experts knew what was best for us, better than we could ever know ourselves. And for the most part, it was true. We as human beings often lack the critical thinking abilities to isolate many exterior variables in our own lives which could lead to disease, and we lack the access to the critical data to make these informed decisions on our own health. In the 90s, when a prescription was handed to anyone in my immediate or extended family, we often took it without hesitation, confident in the system that governed our health. But in the late 90s, I recall vivid conversations of another path. Family members and friends spoke of Asian herbal remedies purchased from these shadowy backroom markets. I remember plastic bags filled with dried roots, barks, and herbs, tagged with these caricatures that I could not understand. And I remember the pungent aroma of this black sludgy brew that was simmering in these foil wrapped kitchens. I remember the stench burning on your nostrils as this acrid, bitter taste would encompass your mouth as you struggle to hold down whatever Miss Chen had given you. God forbid you complain, or worse, you cough up the liquid gold to catch a verbal beating of a lifetime from a true tiger mom. Even as kids, we learned that there are certain mistakes that you only make once. I remember hearing of acupuncture needles, cupping herbs, energy healing, saunas, and long before the world's top coaches were prescribing them to the Olympic athletes, back then these were just our parents' strange pseudotherapies, which we also learned to never utter about in public. I was naive, but not anymore. Because I've learned over time many synthetic drugs are merely derivatives of the natural plant medicines that they replace. And often these natural forms not only work just as well, sometimes they even work better. They often provide a more balanced, holistic healing without the long list of side effects in fine print. Modern science of synthetic derivatives, like any tool, is only as pure as the hands that wield it. And one can argue right now the hands may be a little dirty, because when profit becomes a guiding force, things can be easily manipulated. But if we do not defend what is right, we often forfeit the very core of our own values. And if we do not stand by our own values, we surrender the complete essence of who we are, which is human beings exercising our own choices to live freely. Nowhere is this battle of humanity more evident than in the often covered up story of how the pharmaceutical industry rose to build a trillion-dollar empire. And my friends, that story can be traced back to a long and deliberate sequence of events surrounding the evolution of our modern mental health crisis. We are about to delve into a brief history making the biggest breakthroughs and cash cows of some of the world's most powerful companies in the world. This exploration is crucial to understanding the story of kava, what happened to it and why, but also it serves as a cautionary tale, a reminder of how those in power may have manipulated the threads of time for their own gain. It reveals how simple truths can be obscured with a sleight of hand, covered by a cloud of medical jargon. More importantly, it underscores that this manipulation is not just a relic of the past, but it continues to shape our modern world today. In the late 1700s, Britain suffered a massive loss of exportable tea revenues thanks to the American Revolution cutting off trade access. However, Britain still had well-established trade routes with China, and to make use of these routes and make back their losses, Britain had the idea of growing opium in India and selling it to the East. Opium was massively marketed as a cure-all: headaches, insomnia, diarrhea, cholera, toothaches, even stomach pain. This, of course, led to a widespread addiction epidemic in China, and by the 1800s, opium addiction reached catastrophic levels. As the Chinese government recognized the invasive poppy's devastating grip on society, they sought to sever the supply chain. But Britain, profiting immensely from the trade, fought back. This, of course, led to the famous Opium Wars between Britain and China, which China eventually lost, which led Britain imposing a series of these unequal treaties, ensuring their control over this lucrative market, securing their ability to keep China's massive population dependent and the money flowing westward. Now, there's a morbid irony in today's day and age as we see a similar story unfolding with fentanyl constituents being manufactured in the East and flooding into the Western nations. But that's a story for another day. Soft hangs the opiate in the brain, and lulling soothes the edge of pain, till harshest sound, far off or near, sings floating in its mellow sphere. While opium addiction ravaged in China, the use was not just isolated to the east, but was also growing in other established Western areas. A common family story is a 12-year-old boy would stroll into a pharmacy to purchase a bottle of opium a doctor recommended for their mother's headache. And 3 years later, the mother would still be using this daily just to feel normal. At the same time, the United States was largely preoccupied with the Western expansion and fighting tribal wars and agriculture, at least until a new star was born, Frederick Wilhelm Sertiner. When Frederick was 23 years old, he was an apprentice at a pharmacy in Einbeck, Germany. It was here in 1805 where he successfully isolated the first plant alkaloid from opium and consequently fed it to a nearby dog. The animal fell immediately into a deep sleep. He named his new compound morphine, named after Morpheus, the Greek god of dreams. Physicians hailed morphine as a non-addictive, safer alternative to opium, and it was widely administered during the American Civil War. But it wasn't long before significant cases of soldier's disease became rampant, which is a euphemism for morphine addiction. Then, in 1874, Felix Hoffmann at Bayer Pharmaceuticals synthesized another even better variant of morphine, one that wouldn't carry the same bad reputation. His team synthesizing this compound taught doctors and pharmacists to sell this drug as a safer, non-addictive alternative to morphine. They called this wonder drug heroin. Heroin was offered over the counter without prescriptions in a very similar manner as opium. It was marketed as an over-the-counter miracle drug. It was typically used in the same manner as laudanum, a popular opium tincture at the time, and was commonly used as an over-the-counter medicine for children's cough. This, of course, led to a widespread addiction epidemic for a couple of decades, along with various social and physical health issues. And heroin still remains to be a large problem in the West today. Nearly 2 decades after heroin's debut, and right as sales began to fall, Big Pharma introduced another so-called solution. This time the compound had been synthesized years earlier by Adolf von Bayer. It was said to be a safer and non-addictive alternative to heroin. He called it barbituric acid, or colloquially known as barbiturates. This was the first synthetic tranquilizer and was supposedly named after a lady Barbara that von Bayer had been dating at the time. Once again, doctors and pharmacists were instructed to market barbiturates as a safer alternative to their predecessor heroin. Once again, the risks were downplayed. In the 1930s, marked by the Great Depression, there was an explosion of barbiturate use. Millions of Americans turned to buy these over-the-counter sedatives to take the edge off. Though barbiturates weren't derived from opium, they were working similarly, depressing the central nervous system to reduce brain activity. By the time the US entered World War II, Americans were consuming over 1 billion barbiturates per year. But unlike morphine, heroin, or opium, barbiturates had an alarmingly narrow margin between a therapeutic dose and a lethal dose. In fact, about 1 in 10 overdoses resulted in death, a number that skyrocketed when mixed with alcohol. Legendary musician Jimi Hendrix was a victim to this tragic combination. Famous artist Elvis Presley died from it, Anna Nicole Smith, Judy Garland, Marilyn Monroe, and many, many more. The thin line between a therapeutic and a lethal dose of barbiturate is so pronounced it may surprise you to know that pentothal, a common barbiturate, was later selected as the primary drug used in lethal injections for the death penalty, a practice that actually continues today. By 1951, Congress intervened, making barbiturates prescription only. But by then, the pharmaceutical industry had already had a new replacement in the last stages of development. In 1955, Leo Sternbuck of Hoffmann-La synthesized a new class of drugs, benzodiazepines. These compounds worked on the same neurotransmitter systems as barbiturates, suppressing the central nervous system in essentially the same way, and was sold as a safer, non-addictive alternative to barbiturates. Pharmaceutical companies wasted no time in pushing the narrative for the new drug, Librium. Benzodiazepines were marketed primarily as sedatives and tranquilizers, emphasizing their superiority over barbiturates due to fewer risks of overdose and addiction compared to barbiturates. Posters would often state, safer than barbiturates, non-addictive, low risk. Does this sound familiar? But within a decade, the truth became clear. Benzodiazepines carry the same addictive and similar fatal potentials to their predecessors. Undeterred, Hoffmann-La released a stronger benzodiazepine and repackaged the drug. Their new flagship product, diazepam, also known as Valium. Advertisements emphasize their safety, efficacy, and versatility, targeting both physicians and the general public. And thanks to heavy marketing push, partially orchestrated by the infamous Sackler family, Valium's prescriptions and sales soared. And before ultimately being recognized as a high-risk tranquilizer, the industry had already moved it on to the next iterations, which was Klonopin and Ativan. Though chemically similar to Valium, pharmaceutical companies cleverly began rebranding these drugs as anxiolytics rather than tranquilizers, distancing themselves from barbiturates and opioids. Marketing campaigns assured the public they were safer, faster acting, and less risky than the anxiety relieving drugs that were on the market, despite the fact that 1 milligram of Klonopin was equivalent to about 20 milligrams of Valium. This sleight of hand dramatically increased the overdose potential, but the public was being lost in a multitude of medical jargon and was widely unaware. Now, I don't want this to come off as this is the fault only of the doctors, the pharmacists, the chemists who discovered the drugs, or even employees at these pharmaceutical companies. I believe most people had their best intentions at heart. Some people may have just been worried about losing their jobs for speaking up. It's just unfortunate and slightly ironic how these same situations seem to keep repeating themselves. Then came the poster child of benzodiazepines, Xanax. Xanax was marketed as a powerful and effective medication for anxiety and panic disorders when used as prescribed. However, Xanax quickly developed a reputation in pop culture, especially in hip-hop music and social media, where it was often referenced as a recreational drug. This contributed to increased illicit use, particularly among young adults and teenagers. Now, I grew up around this time, and it was not uncommon for high schoolers to acquire these and use these drugs within the party scene. It was also not uncommon to hear on Monday mornings of the one or two classmates who overdosed on them and ended up in an emergency room. Despite growing concerns, Xanax continues to be one of the most prescribed and widely recognized anti-anxiety benzodiazepines in the world. Now, despite the growing risk of abuse and addiction numbers, the pharmaceutical industry learned something amazing from Xanax and Valium. It was that when benzodiazepines were categorized under a new, more specific category, often as a short-term treatment, the history of the addictive and dangerously abusive potential usually did not follow the new classification of a new category. Business-wise, this makes sense because a company could then release a benzodiazepine as a specific treatment protocol and start with essentially a blank slate. Oftentimes, they'll even downplay that the drug was even a benzodiazepine at all and was instead marketed as a new and emerging drug specifically for these treatments. Examples are anxiolytics, diazepam and alprazolam, hypnotics, temazepam and triazolam, muscle relaxants, diazepam, anticonvulsants, diazepam, clonazepam, pre-anesthetic agents, midazolam, I can't get this one. As of 2024, over 100 million benzodiazepine prescriptions are filled in the US alone. That's roughly 1 for every 3 Americans. And according to the National Institute of Drug Abuse, over 30% of opioid overdose deaths are directly related to benzodiazepines. This is a cycle, the same blueprint again and again. A dangerous drug emerges, a safer alternative replaces it. The truth may be concealed, the consequences are devastating. A safer alternative replaces it again, the pharmaceutical industry profits at every state, and the cycle continues. You starting to see this pattern here? Now, this obviously is not the pattern for all synthetic compounds. Some things are genuinely amazing feats of engineering. Antivirals, antibiotics, immunosuppressants, monoclonal antibodies, metformin, anti-aging drugs like GLP-1, NAD, and many, many more. So what does this have to do with kava? Well, let's go back 20 years to the reintroduction of this fascinating root. It was the summer of 2002 in Munich, Germany. Jess Meyer is walking along the path through a park to get to her doctor's appointment. Her new doctor is a brilliant, forward-thinking physician who prioritizes preventative medicine rather than reactive medication. He prefers to help people make healthier life choices for the future and provides more natural-based, holistic medicines to accomplish this. He guides his patients towards a future free from dependency on synthetic pharmaceuticals. As she passes a playground, the sound of children's laughter fills the air. Pure, unrestrained joy. She slows her pace, taking it in, struck by the realization. How had she been so blind to these simple and beautiful moments before? A year has passed since she fought her way through the darkness of withdrawal, breaking free from heavy sedatives that had gripped her life for more of a decade. What was meant to be a temporary prescription had turned into years of reliance, numbing her to the world around her. But today was different. Today, she felt light, calm, and profoundly grateful for the clarity that she had regained. At the clinic, Jess begins walking to the exam room. She hears arguing from down the hall, a voice rising sharp and louder by the second, and then silence. Suddenly, the door in the back flies open, and her typically cheerful doctor emerges with this angry scowl on his face. He locks eyes with her. In an instant, his expression shifts, softening into an easy, reassuring smile. They exchange pleasantries as Jess sits on the crinkly papered exam bed. Her doctor asks her questions about how she's been, how her mood is, her sleep, what brought her into the clinic. She tells him she's doing great. Alive, finally. She's just looking for routine blood work and a small refill of her prescription. Her doctor stops, spins his chair around and says, "I'm sorry, Jess. I can no longer prescribe you this." Jess is confused, so she asks why. The doctor pauses, then states, "It's a little complicated, but I just received another warning. If I keep prescribing this, they may pull my medical license." The complete takeover of benzodiazepines across the mental health space is exactly around the same time kava came onto the scene. Now remember, in the late 1990s, kava, a ceremonial drink native to the tribes of the South Pacific, was discovered to be highly effective in alleviating anxiety disorders. It was discovered to be so effective and growing in popularity so fast that it began being prescribed by medical professionals in the category of anxiolytics to treat anxiety disorders. This interest in a natural alternative is around the same time that Klonopin and Xanax also began being aggressively marketed in the anxiolytics category. But there was a big difference between kava and Xanax. Kava was a plant, a natural herb. It was found to be non-addictive and did not create chemical dependencies. Xanax, on the other hand, was a fully synthetic compound owned and patented by Pfizer Pharmaceuticals. Researchers found kava did not seem to work off the same channels as all these CNC depressants. Instead, it seemed to enhance your body's natural calming abilities. Because of this, it did not seem to change any of the body's natural neurotransmitter levels, a primary hallmark of an addictive drug. Kava was seeming to be a lighter, non-addictive, completely natural way to manage these mental health disorders, and it was quickly rising to be a beacon of hope for those struggling with these disorders. It also seemed to help people wean off some of these highly addictive opiate derivatives and even alcoholism. For the better part of a decade, forward-thinking doctors were prescribing kava as a natural substitute for these prescription anti-anxiety medications. It was growing so fast that when the 2000s came around, kava prescriptions had grown to roughly 10% of the benzodiazepine market share, which at that time was already a $100 million industry, and to this day is a multi-billion-dollar industry. That's billion with a capital B. Over 450 million daily doses of kava were effectively prescribed during this time. These kava prescriptions were said to be effective and inexpensive and produce no dangerous adverse side effects. Paper after paper was being published on the medical benefits from the ancient tribal plant for anxiety, pain relief, and even cancer-reducing benefits. It was being touted as a natural wonder. But then something strange happened. Jess leaves the office, puzzled and prescriptionless. She picks up her phone and decides to call her close friend Franz. He's an expert researcher in naturopathic medicines. The phone rings and he picks up. He can tell by the sound of her voice that she's troubled. He asks, "What's going on?" She says she wants to know what is happening to a specific natural extract she's been taking. She mentions her doctor just refused to give her the prescription again and that he sounded both infuriated and afraid. Franz recognizes the supplement and tells her he'll call her back after he digs up some more information. It's probably just a mistake. Franz calls up a friend of his, Herbert. Herbert is a lead researcher at a pharmaceutical company that just so happens to manufacture this exact supplement. The phone rings for a long time. Herbert picks up, sounding exhausted.
Hey Herbert, yes, the kids are doing well. The oldest is starting first grade soon. My, how time flies. So anyway, I'm calling to ask about this extract, pipermethysticum. A close friend was just denied her prescription and it's been a lifesaver for her. Do you know what is going on?
Kava, France, you will not believe it. B-Pharm just flagged it as connected to some outstanding liver failure cases. They all happened in the last year or two, and they're pinning it all on this extract.
You have got to be kidding me.
It's been our fastest growing medication category. We even invested in farms overseas and new manufacturing equipment to keep up with demand, and it has all been brought to a sliding halt this last month. It's been a regulatory nightmare. We've been going through all of the cases which don't seem to be correlated to this extract. We even spoke with the medical researchers around the globe about this. They are all just as confused as we are.
To the surprise of everyone in the industry, 26 cases of adverse effects of kava and liver damage suddenly appeared between the years of 1999 and 2000. Now, keep in mind, this was a sliver compared to the 3,500 actual deaths every year from benzodiazepine use during that same time period. But it still was the first time kava had been questioned to be dangerous. However, there's something reportedly off here. These cases could not be confirmed to be explicitly correlated to kava, as there is often a multitude of other drugs that were found in each of these suspects' bodies, which have correlations to liver damage themselves. But before a thorough investigation could be done, B-Pharm, Germany's governing body of drugs and medical devices, immediately began to put a pause on sales authorization for half a dozen prescription products that had kava in the market. That was just the beginning.
B-Pharm officials are swearing these cases are related to this extract, but nothing like this has shown up in any clinical or research data before. It just came out of nowhere,
Well, they're going to tag a warning right. 20-ish cases out of, what, a few 100 million. Even the best OTC drugs like ibuprofen have ratios hundreds of times worse than that. They'll probably just have you put the standard mandatory warning label on it, just like all the other anti-inflammatories.
No, my friend, you don't get it. They completely bypassed all of that and set up a mandatory benefit risk ratio assessment. It looks like they're trying to shut down the whole category. They're tagging every company that makes kava. We talked to our competitors and they are just as clueless. We were the only company with an internal rep at Bee Farm. She was feeding us next steps, but then they all just stopped responding. They ghosted us.
After the immediate authorization pause on the entire category of kava, Bee Farm implemented something called a graduated plan procedure, in which they would reevaluate the efficacy and the potential risks of kava. A graduated plan procedure is normally accomplished by running something called a benefit risk ratio on the product that's in question. In medicine, a benefit risk ratio compares how much good a treatment will do against how much harm that it might cause. Doctors use this comparison to decide if a treatment is worth using. And regulators like Bee Farm use this to decide if a product should be approved for use. So if the positive effects like curing a disease, improving symptoms, outweigh the possible negative effects, then the treatment is considered safe and effective for patients. This helps ensure that patients get treatments that are more likely to help than harm them. However, instead of a standard assessment testing protocol that they usually do with literally every other product that's used in the medical industry, they decided to take a very unique approach. And this is where things kind of went off the rails. Instead of evaluating the abundant history of kava's benefits as a whole, the hundreds of research articles from universities and clinical research around the world, the thousands of years of history of the root being safely used, Bee Farm, Germany's regulatory body for drugs and the largest drug approval authority stretching across all of Europe, decided to restrict the benefit risk assessment only to clinical research undergone by the specific companies who were selling kava in Germany. This meant every single study, every single article, every single paper showing kava's efficacy in anti-anxiety cases, anti-cancer, and even pain relief, and a number of other factors were not considered valid in this assessment. Now, this is fine because a few years prior, each company had already undergone rigorous testing and clinical trials to show the efficacy of product. This was a mandatory process to be approved as a medical product in Germany. These clinical trials easily confirmed the effectiveness of kava in relation to the already published scientific literature on the plant. So kava should have passed with flying colors, right?
What do you mean, ghosted?
I can't get a hold of them. They keep giving me the run around. It started when they first asked for research showing this product has a benefit of any kind. That was easy. We provided them with a number of research journal papers from the top research universities in the world. Their response was that the research was not up to their standards. We then resubmitted our own clinical trials that they had previously approved, along with a number of other clinical trials, including double-blind, placebo-controlled trials from all around the world. They said these trials were not valid either and were not up to their standards. We're talking about clinical data from the top labs at the most prestigious universities in the world. They even rejected the recent one done at Stanford.
That doesn't make any sense. There must be a mistake.
That's what we thought. We were confused, so we asked what about the trials and articles were not up to their standards. And that is when my rep stopped picking up the phone. She won't answer calls, emails, nothing. I can't get a hold of her at all. I think your patient is going to have to find another miracle route for a while.
In an unprecedented move, Bee Farm decided to implement a new set of standards and rules in how they specifically assess the category of kava and how kava's benefit risk ratio will be calculated. Now, this is not normal behavior, and I don't think that this has actually been done before. These new rules stated that kava in particular must qualify under new guidelines for testing to prove efficacy of a positive benefit. Usually older clinical trials are considered to still be valid, but Bee Farm decided that they would enforce this new rule across everything in the present as well as everything in the past, which meant every single clinical trial the companies had completed before this new rule was implemented were now invalid. So since no studies on kava researched elsewhere around the world were considered relevant, no previous clinical trials in the country itself were allowed, no clinical trials by the companies were considered valid, there was then not a single piece of research that now qualified kava to being an effective therapeutic. This meant at the end of Bee Farm's assessment, kava was given a negative benefit risk ratio and marketing authorization was then pulled in 2002. Many researchers often point to the various underlying asymptomatic diseases that a patient might have had that could have led to these liver problems that are not considered during immediate analysis. Diseases such as hemochromatosis, Wilson's disease, autoimmune hepatitis, overlap syndrome, cirrhosis, viral hepatitis, ischemic hepatitis, cardiac hepatopathy, chronic liver disease, Gilbert syndrome, bile duct diseases, systemic sepsis, chlamydial infections, postural conditions, and more, all entirely unrelated to dietary supplements. Any proper researcher knows ad hoc causality assessments are not reliable tools for an accurate diagnosis. They are just assumptions. Keep in mind, pulling marketing authorization is the ultimate last resort. Usually you just slap a warning label on the side for potential risks, or you limit dosage amounts or something along that matter. So this is totally uncalled for. Well, then run some new clinical trials under the new guidelines, you might say. Well, yes, that's true. Although it would be expensive, as clinical trials are commonly in the millions, this was totally doable. But that wasn't the end of it. At that same time, BfArM declared kava was now a new and unknown drug entity. Because of this new classification, this meant that any company selling kava or interested in selling kava now had to run a complete set of preclinical data before they could rerun clinical trials with humans. This meant pharmacodynamics testing, what the drug does to the body, pharmacokinetics, what the body does to the drug, and could include absorption testing, distribution testing, metabolism testing, excretion testing, along with both in vivo and in vitro testing for drug toxicity. Even with these hurdles, it turns out that most of the companies who are being subject to these new bylaws would have done the preclinical animal testing and clinical trials. They would have paid tens of millions of dollars to qualify their product if someone would have told them that they could. Now, it turns out even though this new massive pack of testing was mandatory, the steps and criteria to the application and the approval process for the category of kava were actually hidden from the public and was never explicitly released to the manufacturers or the researchers. So not only did everyone have to start over, no one had the lists of trials and research that was mandatory to get it done. Everybody was just kept in the dark. Now, Herbert and Franz are of course fictional characters, but they're based off real people, and their story is based off real events of things that actually happened, and it makes you really think. Imagine this Kafkaesque scenario. You get a call from your work that you're being put on leave as your university has informed them you never graduated. You contact your university to find out that they're suddenly revoking your degree, citing a need to reassess your academic qualifications. Despite your years of study, research, and successful completion of the coursework, the institution demands you now undergo a battery of new exams, certifications, and evaluations, costing thousands and thousands of more dollars and countless hours. When you inquire about the specific requirements, the university remains tight-lipped, offering only vague assurances that the new standards are more rigorous and better aligned with the industry's needs. Then every request for further clarification is met with silence. Your degree remains in limbo while you navigate an invisible maze of these new prerequisites and undisclosed expenses. It sounds absurd, right? A couple of other rules were stated, one being that the new research would have to be audited and conducted under GLP standards, or good laboratory practices, a standard the majority of studies in all industries to this day do not meet, nor are they required to meet. Even if the producers could react, the damage was already done. The result of these unprecedented regulatory actions and refusal for transparency ended in a seemingly well-orchestrated worldwide panic. In the following months of the initial deauthorization from the most influential drug approval agency in Europe, many countries followed suit and banned kava importation entirely. This completely devastated the industry and drove under thousands of family kava farms in the South Pacific. Many countries still have kava imports banned to this day. Matthias Schmidt, a PhD researcher and herbal specialist who worked on the cases, stated how at this point it was no longer about kava. The same mechanism for denying marketing authorization could be applied to any other herbal or medicinal product under a simple claim of hypothetical risk. One could outright ban ginger based off completely hypothetical risk of injury. The real kicker was not only had they completely collapsed the entire kava market, they also included a formal recommendation to every medical professional to substitute a certain synthetic anti-anxiety compound to kava, which we may or may not have spoken about earlier, effectively monopolizing the market. But why didn't the companies fight these bans in court, as others have in similar situations? Well, they tried, but they couldn't. You see, in Germany, decisions made by a regulatory agency like BfArM cannot actually be legally contested until they are finalized. And in a striking turn of events, BfArM delayed finalizing its decision on kava for 10 whole years, and only doing so after facing mounting individual legal threats for ignoring correspondence on the matter. They were stuck, unable to act upon the category for a decade. That's a long time. BfArM finalized its decision on kava in 2014. The kava companies were left holding marketing authorizations, took BfArM to court then. They laid out a mountain of evidence of seemingly intentional effort to remove kava from Germany's medicinal market. After years of delays and hearings, on June 10th, 2014, the court ruled in favor of the kava companies. The verdict stated new regulations could not be retroactively applied to established products. Mere suspicion about a product's safety was not sufficient grounds for a negative benefit risk assessment or a marketing ban. Claims of kava's liver toxicity were based on assumptions, not hard data, and the actual risk was deemed very rare. The proposed alternatives, benzodiazepines, were not equivalent substitutes as they posed a far greater risk to the patients. At the time of ruling, benzodiazepine deaths in the US alone were estimated at 7,500 per year. By 2021, that number had risen to 12,500 deaths annually, and that's just in the US. Meanwhile, kava, a non-addictive natural remedy, has been removed from the market under false pretenses. Let's take a moment to meditate on this number. It's almost impossible to truly grasp the loss of 12,500 lives. When we see numbers like this, they often feel distant, like statistics on a page. But each one was a living, breathing human being with dreams, ambitions, and the potential to change the world in ways that we will never know. 20 years after the courts had ruled on behalf of the kava companies, on June 30th, 2014, BfArM, Germany's regulatory government agency, appealed the court decision and extended the legal battle. As an update of 2019, BfArM has again pulled marketing authorizations for kava in Germany. So what happened here? Well, no one actually knows for sure. BfArM is not talking about the reasons for making it their highest priority to have kava companies currently approved for use in the country be pulled from the market. No one really knows why BfArM did not tell the companies how they could be reauthorized. No one really knows why BfArM began enforcing more rigorous testing requirements specifically for the category of kava and nothing else. No one knows why BfArM disqualified any and all research spanning the decades of kava's positive benefits. No one knows why BfArM decided to no longer accept any previous clinical data on kava. And no one knows why they were recommending benzodiazepines as a safe alternative to kava. Benzodiazepines, as we have covered earlier, have a long, well-documented history of dangerous side effects, severe addiction, and patient death. Yet, kava remains the one to this day burdened with entire country bans and cautionary labels. Even in the United States today, we are required to place liver risk warnings on anything related to kava, a consequence of outdated cases from Germany's BfArM. Absurd, right? But is it? In 1967, the sugar industry bribed 3 Harvard scientists to publish research papers claiming sugar was harmless and that heart disease was caused by saturated fats, an outright lie that shaped decades of public health policy. And yet, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, my own mother and her geriatric doctor still believes that fat is the culprit. Or take Coca-Cola's Global Energy Balance Network, an initiative designed to downplay the role of nutrition in obesity and shift the blame from sugar consumption. Or the American Heart Association's stamp of approval on cereals like Cheerios and Lucky Charms purchased for less than $650 a year without any real scientific backing. And one of the most memorable moments in pharmaceutical industry that mass media does not report on. In 2004, Merck Pharmaceuticals agreed to a $4.85 billion settlement in lawsuits over its blockbuster drug, Vioxx, which had been generating an impressive $2.5 billion in revenue every single year for the half decade that it was on market. The company was said to have been found liable for deliberately concealing critical data linking the drug to significant cardiovascular risk. By the time Vioxx was finally withdrawn from the market, an estimated 20 million Americans had already been prescribed the medication, and medical researchers determined that approximately 88,000 of those Americans suffered heart attacks as a direct result of taking Vioxx, with a staggering 38,000 proving fatal. Despite the staggering costs and hefty financial penalty, Merck Pharmaceuticals still managed to come out unscathed with a little under $10 billion in net profit from the drug. 38,000. It's a number so staggering that the weight of it almost slips through our fingers. And again, when death is measured in statistics, it becomes easy to overlook the reality. These were people, not numbers. 38,000 empty chairs at dinner tables, 38,000 unfinished stories, 38,000 unique lives robbed from existence. And for every life lost, there are millions more forever altered. The spouses who had to bury their life partner, the children who will grow up without a mother or father. We don't think of loss in numbers, we feel it in moments. It's the phone call that never comes again. It's the birthdays that pass uncelebrated. This loss of life isn't just history, it's happening right now to people just like us. And for what? Money? That should make you mad. It should infuriate you. Are we just a society with a short-term memory? Are we that easily manipulated? Are we so controlled by media that we get glued to Netflix and become docile, weak sheep? Surely we aren't that stupid. Are we? This subject was not for the faint of heart, and because of that, if you made it this far in the talk, I know without a doubt you're probably a human being who has been unplugged from the matrix. I'm not going to tell you to research things for yourself and challenge authority. I'm not going to tell you to never blindly accept what authorities, corporations, regulatory agencies, or doctors tell you. Obviously, I won't tell you those things because I'm not a doctor, but I can tell you, you may find it helpful to research things for yourself. Heck, don't even take my word for it. Do your own due diligence on the opinions I stated here. Use critical thinking, challenge beliefs. It will be hard at first, but these skills are like muscles. The more that you use them, the stronger you get. Seek the truth, and the truth will set you free. So what about kava? Is it true that there is corruption here? Are the systems and agencies that downplay the critical information about addictive and mortal side effects of certain drugs over the last century also the same ones that planned a brilliant maneuver to pull a non-addictive, natural, and unpatentable remedy from consumers who needed it? I don't know. I'm not a medical researcher, physician, or a lawyer, and I of course will not make any claims that will cause this video to be taken down. So again, I don't know, but it is very interesting. You know, sometimes I imagine a world where people believe that heaven on earth is found through spreading the light to others. A world where politicians are driven by a deeper sense of responsibility, caring more for their impact on society than money or their own image. A world where our government treats our hard-earned tax dollars with the same care and deliberation as a child after a summer of tireless work at her lemonade stand who finally saves up enough money to buy her first bicycle. We live in an extraordinary society shaped by remarkable individuals. Though we are not perfect, I believe most of us are good-hearted and striving for something better. It is essential that we stand together, speak up, and take action for the common good. I often think about those who have yet to experience the joy of kava simply because I was a coward, hesitating to talk about this for the last 7 years. As we reflect, let us remember the good we find is not meant to be kept to ourselves. By pushing past hesitation, we not only enrich our own lives, but we also can illuminate a new path for others. Share what is meaningful, extend knowledge freely, and bring others into the discovery. The time to act is now. Well, I hope this was helpful for you and was as eye-opening for you as it was for me. I apologize it took so long to finally make a video of this. It was a doozy. We'll start getting more pumped out faster from now on. Thank you for sticking around, and I apologize if I went a little off topic as I didn't really know where I was going to go with this, so hopefully most of it makes sense. If you appreciate this content, please like and subscribe. Again, share this with a friend who may be on the verge of trying kava and may be hesitant. Spread the word. We do not need to be mere pawns in a grander system of control. We have the power to be the captains of our own lives. Mahalo nui.